It's a pleasure to have Aparajith Ramnath with us. I'll begin by introducing the author. Aparajith Ramnath is a historian of science, technology, and business. He's the author of The Birth of an Indian Profession, Engineers, Industry and the State, 1900 to 1947, Oxford University Press. Aparajith studied electrical engineering at BITS Pilani, and he trained as a historian of science and technology at Oxford University and Imperial College London. He's a recipient of the Young Historian of Science Award 2018 from the Indian National Science Academy. In addition to Chennai, London, and Kozhikode, he has lived in Pune and Bangalore, two cities that are central to the life of M. Visvesvaraya. Aparajith is Associate Professor in the School of Arts and Sciences at Ahmedabad University. And we are so pleased to have him with us here to talk about his new book, his second book, Engineering a Nation. Aparajith will first introduce the book, since I'm sure most of you have not read it, to give you a sense of, the broader, what the book covers, and then we will go into a more conversation and questions about the book.
Thank you so much, Leah. Before I start, I just want to say, I want to introduce my colleague, Professor Leah Matthew, also from the School of Arts and Sciences, from the Social Sciences Division. She has a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, and her research examines the socio-cultural transitions that have accompanied economic liberalization in India. She has a particular interest in education, and her first book came out a couple of years ago. It's called English Linguistic Imperialism from Below, Moral Aspiration and Social Mobility. And Leah's interest in education and social change has made it very fruitful for me to have conversations with her. She kindly read a couple of chapters which pertain to education while the book was in progress, and so it's a particular pleasure to be talking to you today. Thank you. I'd like to thank Anjali Salunke and her team for organizing this event, helping organize this event. All my colleagues, all of you in the audience, students, so many people who have supported me in so many ways over the last 7 years, I think now that this project has been in progress. If you have the time, a full acknowledgements is in the book. It's about 7 pages, so you can read. So I'm not going to name anybody further right now. So what I'm going to do now is read out an abridged version of the book's introduction, so that there may be some people in the audience who don't know the details of Visvesvaraya's life. So why is he important? Why should we know about him? So I'll give you some of that background information in about 10 minutes. And hopefully it also gives you a flavor of the book. Mokshagundam Visvesvarya was easily the most famous Indian engineer of the 20th century, but he was also much more. 6 decades after his death, there's scarcely a walk of life in India that doesn't bear in some form the imprint of his work, not only as civil engineer, which we all know, but also as public administrator, constitutional analyst, and economic thinker. If you've picnicked in the Brindavan Gardens near the KRS Dam near Mysore, if you've studied in Bangalore's Indian Institute of Science, or Mumbai's Institute of Chemical Technology, formerly known as UDCT, if you lived through the heyday of the Planning Commission, if you're a farmer or know a farmer near Pune or Mysore, if you're a Hyderabadi whose drinking water comes from the Himayat Sagar or Osman Sagar, or if you swear by Mysore sandal soap, you have experienced directly a part of Visvesvaraya's legacy. He was born in a village near Bangalore in 1861. Around the time the British Crown took over from the East India Company in the subcontinent. Visvesvaraya began his career as a public works engineer in the Bombay Presidency, where he spent a quarter of a century. As a government engineer and later as a consultant, he contributed to the design, building and maintenance of large irrigation works, dams, and urban water supply and drainage schemes across the length and breadth of the subcontinent. As he approached the age of 50, he accepted the position of chief engineer and then Diwan, or prime minister, of the princely state of Mysore, which was his home state. There he pursued ambitious public works projects as part of a program to industrialize the state and rationalize its administration. He was instrumental in the inauguration of a gigantic multipurpose dam project on the river Kaveri, the institution of the first university in princely India, the establishment of several industries in the state, most notably an iron factory, just a few years after Tisco in what became Jamshedpur, and the founding of a bank and a chamber of commerce in Mysore. In retirement, Visvesvaraya placed himself on the All India stage. You can see it's a long life, it's a 101-year life, and he was active well into his 80s. In addition to being on a number of committees related to engineering and technical education, he developed a distinctive vision for national development. He's one of the pioneering proponents of economic planning and a tireless campaigner for Indian industrialization. He was an evangelist for rapid industrialization. He promoted these ideas through a number of pamphlets and books. Some of them are here. Reconstruction in Post-War India, which he wrote in 1920, soon after stepping down from the Diwanship of Mysore. Planned Economy for India, 1934. Nation Building, 1937. And there are many more in this vein. As scholars have argued, Visvesvaraya's vision, with its emphasis on large-scale industry, technical education, and planning, formed a precursor to Jawaharlal Nehru's nation-building program after independence. Although, when Nehru then became Prime Minister, they had a number of differences, the broad sort of elements of their vision are comparable. Both men were part of one of the earliest cohorts to receive the Republic's highest civilian honor, the Bharat Ratna, the same year, 1955. Indeed, it would be no exaggeration to say that Visvesvaraya's life mirrored the emergence of the modern Indian nation. Born 4 years after the uprising of 1857, he came of age as colonial rule reached its zenith. He was in his 20s when the Indian National Congress was established. In his 50s, when World War I shook the foundations of colonial rule. In his nearly 70, when Mahatma Gandhi led the Salt March to Dandi. By the time he was done with the business of life, Visvesvaraya had witnessed not just the coming of independence, but also the first 3 general elections and the first 2 5-year plans of the new republic. Today, Visvesvaraya is enjoying a resurgence as a national icon. His memory is invoked frequently in the context of nation building. His birthday is celebrated every year as Engineers' Day. Just passed a couple of weeks ago. Metro rail stations have been named after him in Delhi and Bangalore. Educational institutions across the land bear his name. So do new government schemes. In Karnataka, Visvesvaraya has long been deified. Statues, busts, and portraits of the former Diwan are to be found in public parks, residential localities, street corners, shops, factories, and institutions of various kinds. Even Google carried a doodle on his birthday in 2018. The picture on the left, it says Annadatta Visvesvaraya, and it is in a village in Mandya district, which benefited from the KRS dam and became a prosperous sugar growing belt. And on the right is one of the many other statues that you can see in Bangalore and Mysore. This one is outside the Institution of Engineers, India. Now, part of Visvesvaraya's appeal lies in his image as an apolitical technocratic champion of development. Technological solutions to challenges of governance and social problems enjoy wide popularity today. And at the same time, there is increasing public debate on the limits of such visions, not least from the viewpoint of sustainability and the environment. Are large multipurpose dams the best way to serve the aims of electricity generation and irrigation? Is large-scale industrialization the only route to poverty alleviation? And to what extent is economic autarky or self-sufficiency necessary or useful for a nation? In this context, the need for a deeper understanding of Visvesvaraya's life and a nuanced appreciation of his legacy in all its shades is growing more urgent. There are other reasons too why it's time for a reappraisal. Despite his renewed ubiquity as an icon, he remains a cipher to most Indians, at least outside Karnataka. We're all familiar with his frail, unsmiling, turbaned visage, which is what we normally see, but tend to know few details of his career and contributions. When he's highlighted, he's seen in narrow terms as an ingenious engineer and an uncompromising administrator. But there were other dimensions to his life. Visvesvaraya is also an important figure in India's political history, one who deserves to be studied as seriously as Nehru, Gandhi, Ambedkar, Tilak or Bose. He was deeply involved in the vital constitutional debates of his day. He negotiated with viceroys and maharajas, played an important role in the fortunes and outlook of the princely states. In many ways, he was an honorary member of the Indian liberals, the intellectual descendants of Dadabhai Naoroji and M.G. Ranade, who you see at the top there. He was also a close associate of moderate Congress leaders such as Gopal Krishna Gokhale, Madan Mohan Malaviya and M.R. Jayakar, working very closely with the last two of them to push for a roundtable conference in the interwar years. Ultimately, Visvesvaraya was not invited to the conference, but the other two did go, and when they were there in London, the artist Emery Kellen made these caricatures of them. There are caricatures of all the attendees, and it's wonderful to look at. The engineering side of Visvesvaraya's career also requires deeper analysis. He's popularly thought of as the greatest or even the first modern Indian engineer. But in fact, there were several other accomplished Indians in the profession, both before and during his time. So how do we understand and account for his larger-than-life image as an engineer? In what specific ways did his career as an engineer shape his ideas on industrialization, development, and social reform? Were these beliefs already developing when he was a public works engineer? Or were they mainly a result of his study tours? He visited Japan, Europe, and America many times. How did he construct his claim to authority and expertise in diverse fields? As an engineer, how did he get people to listen to him when he spoke about economics and development? Finally, we know little about the man himself, his strengths and his foibles, the conflicts and the negotiations involved in his career. Icons are always in danger of becoming caricatures, and so it has been in his case. The public's understanding of his historical role is shaped largely by reverential and even hagiographic accounts, anecdotal history, and indirectly by his own very reticent autobiographical writings. Placed in the pantheon of national heroes, he has ceased to be a person. If we are to do justice to his life and career, we must peel back the layers of the public persona. What made this idealistic and fastidious personality tick, who seldom appeared in public without a full suit, white leather shoes, and Mysore peta or turban, who was almost never photographed smiling, who refused to meet visitors without an appointment, who apparently shirked publicity as a person while publicizing his ideas throughout his life? What gave him his unshakable belief in the possibility of turning India, with its bewildering diversity of peoples, into a melting pot? These are the questions I set out to explore. I decided I would pay close attention to the engineering side of his life, which most popular accounts skip over quickly. I wanted to look at how his training as an engineer and his experiences in this phase influenced his thinking on developmental and economic issues later on. Second, I wanted to stress the historical context in which he is working. Rather than portraying him as a timeless genius who descended fully formed onto the earth, I wanted to understand the prevailing trends in engineering and how his work fit into that story. Third, I wanted to bring to life the intellectual and official engagements with other people that shaped his life. I spent a lot of time in the book talking about his industrialist friends, his bureaucratic colleagues, subordinates, the teachers of his youth, the Diwans of Mysore who preceded him, and the royals of Mysore under whom he worked. Finally, I decided that the book's narrative would be firmly anchored in primary sources. As the scholar Chandan Gowda has noted, myths and unverifiable stories about Visvesvaraya abound. I'm sure all of you have got some WhatsApp forwards about him, about how he was traveling in the train and pulled the chain because he could hear that there was a crack in the tracks 2 kilometers ahead and so on. Even the basic facts of his life have become fuzzy over many retellings. I resolved early on, therefore, to prioritize contemporary sources such as newspaper reports, official documents, letters, memos, etc. I found such sources in many archives in Delhi, Bangalore, Mysore, Mumbai, London. I retraced his footsteps, spending time in various cities to get a sense of atmosphere, and I spoke to those who had known him or thought about his legacy. Counterfactuals are never easy, but it's hard to imagine Indian history without Mokshagundam Visvesvarya. His legacies are many and varied. His story is also the story of irrigation in the subcontinent, of princely India in a time of great flux, of technology and industrialization in an incipient nation, of the conundrum of what it meant to be a scientific Indian. that is the story that this book tries to tell.
Can you go to the first slide? For anybody who has ever written a class final project or, thesis proposal, anything, the summary of everything that Aparajith just said, the title so well captures it. Could you tell us how you came to this title? Was it there earlier on, or when did you chance upon the title?
So, funnily enough, this was just a working title that I gave when I put in the proposal for the book, and I thought, this is what I have in mind, but I'll think about it later. And then I had conversations with the editors, and they said, no, I think this fits. So we kept it. But how did I think of it in the first place? This, by the way, happened in 2017 when I was first asked to work on this book. But I think it has something to do with my first book, which was obviously also about engineers. And in the many doctoral seminars and discussions, I think we had some discussions about how engineers relate to the nation and so on. So I think it must have been somewhere there in my consciousness. And this is exactly what he tried to do, I think. So.
Right. So one tension that runs throughout the book is your attempt to sort of guard against his greatness in a way, while doing justice to the phenomenal breadth of his career. Right. And one way that you do is you take pains to show, whether it is in Sindh or in Pune, whose work he was building on, what was his team like. So he's not just this sole brilliant engineer. How did you go about looking for and finding this kind of material?
Thank you. I wouldn't say I guarded against his greatness. I was guarding against an unrealistic vision of his greatness, I think. He was great in the sense that anyone who has great ambitions and who puts a lot of effort into realizing them is great. But that doesn't mean he was flawless. And I think that's what I wanted to be wary of. I wanted to see him as a person, what would it have been like to have been around when he was there, to be a contemporary? What would other people have thought of what he was doing? But more importantly, how was he coming to these views and these decisions and these projects? And so I think my view was, any biography, you come neither to neither to praise nor to bury, I think I don't remember the quotation now, but I think it needs to be empathetic. It needs to try and understand the world from the point of view of that person, but at the same time also, treat them as a person who is fallible and who has various influences and other things. So to get to your question, how does one go about looking for these things? I think just going into the archives with an open mind, trying to not, do a Control F and say, look at only the things that have Visvesvaraya in them, but look at all the documents before and after the one that you're interested in. Try and look at a lot of newspaper reports. It's not really very hard, because if you keep your eyes open, you're bound to see that there were a lot of other people doing this stuff. Provided, and I think what helped me was the background of the previous book, which was more academic study. I won't say this is not academic. This is meant for a broader audience. But the previous book obviously was looking at the profession of engineering, the social history of engineering at a similar time. And so I was already attuned to a lot of the trends that were happening at that time. The fact that how many engineers were there, for instance, how many were British, how many were Indian. Was he the first to become superintending engineer in a British province or not? So I had some clue about these contextual factors. But I think a lot of accounts, a lot of the more popular accounts just look at his his CV and try to explain what he did, rather than seeing him as an actor among a larger group of people. So the moment you do that, there's a lot of material there. Some things are more difficult than others. I found the early part of his career quite difficult to get information on, especially his childhood and his time as a student, and even his early years in the Bombay PWD. So I think you then have to try and get at it through various means, through indirect references, and so on. So I think that's one reason why maybe the second half of the book is a bit more expansive than the first.
As you saw from what Aparajith had presented of the book, Visvesvaraya was called in as an expert by city administrators and planners, and his approach to solving the challenges of the urban are very familiar to us today. So I would request Aparajith to read for us his account of the Hyderabad flood in 1908. So these are big floods, and then Visvesvaraya's solution to the problem.
So just a little context. Visvesvaraya was at this time about 47 years old. He had just decided to take early retirement from the Bombay PWD because he thought he was not going to be made chief engineer. He was actually promoted much faster than everyone else, but he still wanted to get there sooner, so he decided to quit. And then he went on a foreign tour to Europe, and at this time he got this call from the Nizam's government in Hyderabad saying there's been this horrible flood in the river Musi, and they needed someone to come and advise them. Eventually he complied. This was in the brief interregnum between his PWD career and his going back to Mysore. That year, Hyderabad had an unremarkable monsoon. Then, in late September, a cyclone originating above the Bay of Bengal homed in on the region, causing torrential rain. On Sunday, 27 September, the correspondent of the Times of India reported that it had been raining for 10 days. Over the last 32 hours, the entire state had witnessed, I quote, one heavy incessant downpour without a minute's abatement, end quote. The lashing rain had cut off the railway line from Secunderabad to Bezwada, today's Vijayawada. Near Begumpet in the new city, I quote, the country was descended as one huge roaring sea, end quote. The Hussain Sagar, although it was equipped with sluices, threatened to overflow. The unrelenting thunder showers meant the tanks above the city were filled to the brim. In the wee hours of 28th September, the tanks, this refers to many traditional old tanks, began to rupture until more than 200 of them had been breached. The Musi swelled and a hurtling mass of water swept furiously through the city. The Afzalganj and Chadarghat bridges came crashing down, and the river waters razed a nearby hospital to the ground. I quote, houses collapsed like pack of cards, the Times of India reported, and thousands fled panic-stricken and terrified before the roaring avalanche. In desperation, people scaled the walls of the old city, hung onto trees, gathered in large houses. Most were washed away. In the end, some 19,000 dwellings were destroyed, with around 80,000 citizens cast out onto the streets. A scarcely imaginable 10,000 to 15,000 Hyderabadis lost their lives. Should I read the next part as well? Yeah. And now we come to the part when Visvesvaraya reaches and forms his team with the local PWD engineers. To deal with the threat of large-scale floods, Visvesvaraya's team first had to understand the underlying causes of the recent disaster. Systematic and data-driven as his approach was, this meant reliving the horrors of the last September in minute detail. Approaching a scene of such devastation, even much after the event, Visvesvaraya, Ahmed Ali, his colleague, and their other colleagues must have needed nerves of steel and the calmness of battle-hardened military surgeons. Blocking out for the moment emotions and the stories of individuals, they set about reducing the problem to one of physics and hydraulics. Visvesvaraya dispatched officers to collect relevant data from various locations in the catchment and channel of the Musi. He analyzed historical rainfall records to establish that the intensity of rain in September 1908 outstripped anything recorded in recent decades. The team also traced the contours of the floods, helping Visvesvaraya painstakingly reconstruct the sequence of events. He calculated that on 28th September 1908, the floodwaters had come charging down at 4,25,000 cubic feet per second, more than 4 times the carrying capacity of the Musi. There is no record, he wrote, of a runoff of such intensity for a catchment of this size in any part of the world. Having crunched the data, Visvesvaraya concluded that the destructiveness of the floods was chiefly due to the inadequacy of the tanks in the EC-Musi catchment area. EC and Musi are the twin rivers. That fateful weekend in 1908, 221 out of the 788 traditional tanks had been breached. He emphasized this point in his report. The fall of rain was no doubt heavy, he said, but had the tanks not burst simultaneously, the flood would not have risen to the great height it did. End quote. These old crumbling tanks could not be relied upon anymore to regulate the flow of a river in spate. What was required, therefore, was the construction of two large reservoirs upstream of Hyderabad city, one on the river Musi and one on its tributary, the EC.
This seems quite familiar to us, especially this year. There have been so much destruction with floods, and the kinds of solutions that are posed, of big reservoirs, big dams, and data crunching. These are things that we are familiar with today. So when you were writing this, what sort of connections were you able to make with the contemporary?
I think, we all know about, we're warned as historians not to be presentist, present-centered, and use, our opinions about the present or allow them to color what's happening. But of course, it's inevitable to some extent. We live in the present. We're writing in the present. So of course, one has that in mind. I don't explicitly draw that connection anywhere in the body of the book. In the epilogue, I permit myself to muse on what the connections may be between the past and the present. So I think that's the way I approach it. When I'm looking at what's happening, I'm trying to view it from the point of view of those people. What did they know? What technology did they possess? What was par for the course at that time? So the kinds of things he's suggesting, as you rightly said, are now the way we think about these things, and that's largely down to people like him, right? And that's the point I'm making. He's one of the first technocrats, is making it normal to think about certain kinds of solutions. I'm not saying that these solutions are wrong per se, but that with time and with our knowledge about various other factors, we need to modify and work on them. But at the time, I think it's quite clear that in many other things that he's doing, it's not that he's coming up with something that no one's ever thought of, but he's bold. He's looking at things he's seen in other places and he's trying to replicate them, or he's trying to take on certain. He's taking the long view, right? He doesn't want to just take care of what's the problem at the moment, but he's saying what can we do that can stop this sort of thing from happening for the next 5 decades or whatever. And to a large extent, he succeeded in this case.
So Visvesvaraya then returns to Mysore as the chief engineer and very quickly becomes the Diwan as well. And the modernization that he sets in motion is very impressive for his fans, and for his detractors a bit too ambitious. So as you saw in the slides, the KRS Dam, the Mysore University, Mysore Sandal Works, even a bank, and the much contested Bhadravati Iron Works. Can you contextualize this modernization drive for us? How was the British and the princely states, how were they approaching industrialization and public services like education?
Okay, so I think a lot of people have worked on princely modernity and the so-called model princely states, which are Mysore, Travancore, Baroda. I'm forgetting the fourth one. Can someone help me? Baroda, Mysore, Travancore, Hyderabad. No, not Hyderabad. Well, anyway, it'll come back to me. I'm blanking. But there were these 4 large princely states which were positioning themselves as being modern, in the sense that they were actually competing with the British provinces and trying to show that they could be one step ahead. Mysore is very much part of that trajectory, and I try to show in the book that it doesn't start with Visvesvaraya. It starts from the 1880s with the previous Divans, Rangacharlu and Seshadri Iyer, who really shared his, they were not engineers, but they shared his way of thinking about development, about industries and all of these things. And of course it was it was largely a Western vision, but they were trying to out-British the British, right? So one of the problems with Mysore University, for instance, and the scholar Manu Bhagwan has written very nicely about this, is that the permissions were they were blocking them from creating Mysore University for a long time, and partly this was because the arguments advanced for creating Mysore University was that the existing university system in British India was moribund, and that they would create something that would be better and more practical and more advanced. And so, of course, this is not something that they could have, and but ultimately it worked out. But I think Visvesvaraya is bringing a couple of things. One is a continuation of this sort of modernization trajectory that's there with previous leaders in Mysore, and it's clearly part of the intellectual atmosphere there. But he's also he's stepping it up. He's trying to do in 6 years. He didn't know that he would be Diwan only for 6 years, but in those 6 years he did what previous people did over 30 years. And this is clearly coming from a number of things. His admiration of Japan, which is after the Meiji Restoration, this exemplar of modernization, westernization, national strength in the face of supposed characterization as a lesser society, and he's a great admirer of that. He tries to replicate a lot of that. He's also an admirer of the US. He travels frequently there, and he is. Of course, bringing also to bear some vital elements of his philosophy of irrigation and the agrarian economy, which he has gained over 25 years of serving as an engineer in the Bombay PWD. When they say Bombay, I mean Bombay Presidency. So he was in the Deccan, he was in Sindh, he was even in Ahmedabad for a while, to do with one of the water supply projects. So what he gains from there is a view that this predominantly agrarian mode in which the Indian economy is not sufficient to provide a decent standard of living to the masses. It needs to change. You need to move to an industrial society. And in this, he's also drawing upon his intellectual ancestors, starting from Dadabhai Nauroji down to M.G. Ranade. M.G. Ranade was a close associate of his when he was posted in Pune, and Gokhale. Gokhale was actually younger to Visvesvaraya, but it was almost someone he looked up to in intellectual terms. And so he's drawing these ideas. This is the nationalist school of economics, which is talking about the need for industrialization. And of course, the nationalist school of economics held that the British were holding back Indian industrialization by refusing to grant protection to Indian industries, by basically not providing any kind of subsidies or encouragement to local entrepreneurs. So that's what Mysore sets out to do. They set out to create this protected economy, which what another scholar, Bjorn Hetne, has called state capitalism. So the state is providing the incentive for industrialization, hence the large multipurpose dam, the electricity generation plant in Sivasamudram, which is then supplying electricity to the Kolar gold fields, and then hence the creation of a bank, a chamber of commerce, and this iron factory in Bhadravati, which is supposed to be creating a basic industry which will then produce the materials for further industrialization. The problem, according to his critics, of course, was that it was really, really expensive to do this. There was a problem of resources. Yes, there was iron ore, but there was no coal in Mysore. And so they set out to produce charcoal iron. They said they would get wood from the forests of the dense Malnad region, which is in the the Shivamogga area, Chikmagalur, Coorg, all of those areas. So they would fell trees and then use the charcoal to produce iron. And now, in theory, charcoal iron is of a superior quality to coal-fueled iron. And should fetch a higher price, but it didn't work out that way. This was being done during the time of World War I, when people were saying that there's going to be change in market conditions. Sure enough, there was a huge fall in the price of iron after World War I. People were melting cannons and other things from Belgium and Germany and dumping steel in India, steel and iron steel, and Bhadravati was never a financial success. It took 30 years for it to even approach that, but it was a symbolic success. It was something that people were proud of. It was something that he was proud of. And so much of the tension between Visvesvaraya and his critics is this view of, we need to do this because it represents modernization, it represents progress, versus somebody else saying, yes, but at what cost? Who's paying for it? And are there other solutions? And I think that's a classic conundrum that lives with us to this day.
So the book that Visvesvaraya wrote, Reconstructing India, you write that it is an engineer's report, but it's about political, economic and social issues. Can you tell us what an engineer's report usually looks like, and why you felt that a book on politics, economy and social issues was like an engineer's report?
I don't know if I have a picture of the table of contents there, but I mean, it's I don't know what, to be honest, I don't know what exactly engineers' reports today look like. They're probably too complex for me to understand, despite my degree, which is gathering dust somewhere. But the engineering reports which were written at his time, I could follow, because they were actually, there was not too much mathematization. There was a lot of rule of thumb. There's a lot of description, but it is very modular, right? So there are numbered paragraphs, like all colonial official documents, sections and subsections, and there's very clear sense of, okay, this is being written in order to lay out what's the issue, what are the methods, what's the solution, and he does that in a very similar way. He has a section on political reconstruction, a section on social reconstruction, a section on economic reconstruction, and it's very lucidly written, but not at all in the way that you'd expect of someone who's making a political argument or social scientific argument. That's not to say he was apolitical. I think that's the other thing that I wrestle with in the epilogue. I mean, I'm saying two things. I'm saying that he's the progenitor of technocracy and technocratic thinking, which we associate with apolitical solutions. But of course, we know that no position is completely apolitical, and he did have his politics. But for him, his politics stemmed from his vision of economic progress. And so for him, all his political positions stemmed from what he thought was needed for India to become industrial. So if he criticized the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms of 1919, it was on the grounds that there was not enough provincial autonomy, because only if there was provincial autonomy, provinces could make the best use of their resources to industrialize. If he was, he actually wrote, not many people know this, but he wrote a draft constitution. It's very small, it's 25 pages, but a draft constitution for India on the Dominion model. That is to say that, and this is what most people were asking for until the 1930s. Most nationalists were asking for Dominion status, which meant that India would be an autonomous part of the British Empire, like Australia, Canada. Australia, Canada were his favorite examples when it came to constitutional matters. So he actually wrote a draft constitution. He didn't reveal his name. He did it for M.R. Jayakar, who he was working with. And Jayakar tried to get this implemented and so on. It never happened. But he was interested in all of these things. But you can see very clearly in the way that he's arguing that he's doing it in a very sort of I don't know how to explain this. It's a wonderful question. Maybe I will, for a future talk, I will pull out pages from it and show that's the only way I can explain it.
Mm-hmm. So Visvesvaraya was on several committees, some of them related to engineering, like the Bombay Back Bay reclamation scandal, and some that had nothing to do with engineering, like the communal violence in 1928 in Bangalore. So he had acceptance and legitimacy among the public, among administrators, among politicians, among businessmen. Why do you think that was so?
I think he was unusual in the sense that he interacted. He had a curiosity about people well outside his line of work, right? Even though he himself, would never. I mean, I don't think he ever read a novel for enjoyment. I don't think he, I don't think he really had hobbies in the way that we think about them. He really lived his work, and he was, full professional in that sense. You could say a workaholic is, I think one of the blurbs says. But he did have a curiosity and a respect for people who came from different disciplinary viewpoints. So witness his interaction with Gokhale and Ranade and others when he was in Pune. He was instrumental in forming something called the Deccan Club, which still exists, a small club in Pune. And it was meant to be a place for all of these intellectuals to sit and talk about various things, but most importantly for British and Indians to mingle, which was not very common in club life at that time. So he wanted to. So one observer puts it like this: there was this distinction in bureaucratic life between officials and non-officials. And so if you were a PWD officer or an IAS or ICS officer or whatever, you almost felt that you were above those who were not officers in that way. And so he was known from an early stage to be unusual in seeking out the company of non-officials and trying to understand what they were saying and what they were thinking. And this had a bit of danger because, if you're talking to somebody who's advancing critiques of the colonial government and you're an officer of the government, then of course you're exposing yourself to some sort of criticism. And he was very careful. So when he made his first trip to Japan, he wrote up his notes and he says that he didn't publish them because he was worried it would be perceived as a critique of what's happening in British India. Having said that, he was somehow he was able to pull off this balancing act because although he perceived himself as not getting his due, he was actually treated very, very well by his British superiors compared to what other Indian engineers felt. It was a highly racialized, atmosphere. There were lots of prejudices about Indian engineers and so on. But if you read what his superiors, how they treat him, I say in the book, he was treated like an honorary Englishman in many senses. So that was partly because, Shiv Vishwanathan says somewhere that if you leave out his turban, he's from the neck down, he was an Englishman. And I think in many ways, the institutions he went to the Wesleyan Mission School, he went to the Central College, he went in Bangalore, he went to the College of Science in Pune, all colonial institutions, strong role models from, one was a British principal, one was an Irish principal, so on. So, and his reading, we talk about his syllabus in his BA. He did a BA, but in science subjects. And so he was, intellectually very, very Western. So he was able to form a bridge with so he was trusted by the colonial officialdom in that sense. He was seen as a bit of a nuisance because he would, he said what he thought, but at the same time he was seen as someone who was above, corruption, above favoring his friends, all of those things, and that won him some trust in those eyes. As far as industrialists are concerned, he made friends with them again in the Deccan Club in Pune and other places. So he was very close with someone called Vitaldas Thakursi, who was one of the many cotton tycoons. Later with Walchand Hirachand, and with the Tatas, he was on good terms. He was actually on very good terms with them because for him, in his vision, industrialization was the mana. It was the way to development, and these were the agents who could make it happen. These were the people who could do it for India. Now he never bothered too much about questions of, if there's protection, who should gain from it? Is it a level playing field for other entrepreneurs? So he didn't worry too much about those things. So he saw these people as agents of progress. Perhaps in a way like Gandhi saw them as trustees of the future and so on. So he did have this ability to build bridges. He has a very dry correspondence, but with a wide range of actors on all of these subjects. And so yes, I think he was kind of, and he was also not, he was not a formal member of any political party. He was not seen in Bombay. He could be seen as a Mysorean. In Mysore, he could be seen as a British India product. So he was kind of acceptable to a large variety of people. I think one of the things that's very interesting is that he actually ended up being chairman of an all India political conference in 1921, which is known as the Malaviya Conference, where people were coming together after the terrible events of Jallianwala Bagh and all of those things and the repression that followed, and they're trying to push the Viceroy for a roundtable conference. They're doing this for 10 years, and it finally happens in 1930. But in Kawasji Jahangir Hall in Bombay, the same hall where he received his engineering degree, by default, he's a member of the organizing committee. Jaikar, Malaviya, Jinnah, who was part of that group at that time, were all part of the organization. C. Shankaran Nair was originally the chairman of the conference, but he stepped down because of differences with Gandhi, and Visvesvaraya became the chairman of this huge pan-Indian political conference, which as an engineer, he would not have seen coming.
If you look at the courses that you teach here at the university and your book together, what connections are you able to draw out, particularly for your students? Oh. Very good. So this is particularly for students who have taken your courses. If you look at the courses that you teach here and your book together, what connections are you able to draw out for them?
Can I ask them to do it?
No, so this will sort of help them to read your book.
Yeah. No, I think some of you have a course called Industrialization Perspectives from World History, which looks at the global history of industrial revolutions across the world, not only in different countries, but also looking at the linkages. How do we understand industrialization in one country without knowing what its interactions with the rest of the world were? And so I think for me, that helped a lot in getting a context into, what is he seeing when he's looking at Japan? What is he seeing when he's looking at Lancashire? And why does he think that this is this universal, replicable process which can happen in the same way in different places? So I think that history tells us a lot about, ideas of industrialization as an agent of social change. Because Visvesvaraya is also a modernizer. He's a social reformer, right? As was Ranade and others. So he's interested in creating a more, I would say, a casteless society. There are people who critique him on certain grounds, but he wanted to create what he saw as a modern society without so many hierarchies and without the stultifying effect of tradition as he saw it again. So I think that history of industrialization, that history of what it meant for other nations that had become rich, is very crucial. So I think that's one link. The other course I'm teaching right now is called Science, Tech, and the Making of the Modern World. And I think the ideas of modernity, ideas of how colonialism is tied in with aspirations to certain kinds of modernization. All of these things play into it. But I shall not say more because I want students to tell me.
I'm sure the book is much more readable than your course pack, so I would strongly encourage you to read it. So biography is not really a fashionable genre in academic history. How did you navigate disciplinary expectations when you were writing the book?
I mean, at one level, I just wanted to write it, so I wrote it. But I think, I do gesture briefly to it in the introduction. Yes, we are now aware that history cannot be told as a story of great men alone. Right. There are many actors. People don't act in isolation. There are social forces. There's contextual forces. There's agency versus structure. All of these things. I think the reason biography tends to sometimes not be seen as serious is that it doesn't. A certain kind of biography doesn't take into account all of those things and seems to attribute too much to one individual. Now, a biography doesn't have to be written that way. I think we can use a person as a lens to look into a lot of other broader currents. We can look at their lives and look at the lives of people around him. I mean, frequently in the book, I step away to talk about other people for several pages. And I think for me, it was an opportunity to use each phase of this long and eventful life as a window into what was happening in Mysore, in India at that time, and for me to understand it, and in giving the background of that, and understanding both how it shaped him and how he shaped those events. And so I think yes, there is the danger of attributing too much to one person, or thinking that if this person had not been there, these things would not have happened. We can't say that. Maybe somebody else would have done it. But I think I'm very interested in. At least I grew up. Nowadays, unfortunately, I don't read so much fiction, but I grew up reading a lot of it. I'm a failed novelist. I wanted to write novels. So this is my way of getting that chance to explore, all of those nuances of, a person's psychology, temperament, and how that interacts with the larger sort of social context. And then, there are many fascinating biographies that do that. So I think, I've tried to take the best of those approaches, I guess.
Did you have conversations with Patrick about the book and about biography?
Yes, a few. Sadly, not as many as I'd like, and I would dearly have liked to see him here today, and he would have been very happy to see this come out. Patrick was very encouraging, very helpful. One of the things he did tell me was to give stage time to the other people. It's not just he did this and he did that and he did that. So you need to have other people in the story, their conflicts, their interactions, what they're learning from each other. And I think Patrick is also a great example of how you can combine academic rigor in terms of research with a style that is, that's very, very readable, and not only readable, but nowadays readable is seen as pejorative. But so the first couple of times somebody said, "Oh, it's an easy read," I was like, "Are they criticizing me?" But also his work is so so evocative and beautifully written. I think, and I think, just the fact that he knew what it took in the early days when we were setting up the institution, and all of us were part of that process. But just things like, a faculty member needs leave to go to an archive, and he understood those things. So I think all that helped to set certain things in place.
Last question. When you started with the project, did you imagine that you would be writing a 737-page book? Usually, our books are like 250 pages. What all changed in the process?
No, I didn't. I was asked to write it in 2017, and they said I should finish it in 2019. Of course, I knew I would never finish it in 2009. I'm very, very slow with everything. But I thought maybe 4 years, maybe 5 years, not this long. To be honest, I didn't know how many pages it would be, because we work with A4 pages. I'm not really experienced enough to know how that translates to this. When I started, I thought it would be 300 pages or something like that. And for the longest time, my worry was, how am I going to have enough to make a book? Because it's really difficult to get stuff about Visvesvaraya, at least in the beginning. He was very reticent. He didn't leave a lot of gossipy letters. He didn't. His diaries were torn up or destroyed when he passed away, or before he passed away. He was married early in his life, but he had suffered bereavements, and he was a single person from the age of 30 to 100. He didn't have that many close associates. Even his friends were people he spoke about various causes with. So it's initially it felt like it was going to be very difficult to get at this person, what he did. But it started kind of building up slowly, and I made detailed chronologies and lots of tables and other things, and then writing, and didn't set myself a limit. I just basically thought it's got to be as long as it needs to be for me to understand what I've set out to understand. Then, of course, I expected that they would ask me to cut it down, but for whatever reason they didn't. So, so here we are.
If you have any questions from the audience, we can take them now. We have mics.
Hi, Aparajith. Thank you for your talk. I look forward to reading your book. I actually grew up with legends of Visvesvaraya. Every year in Bangalore, every school year, one English chapter and one Kannada chapter would always be about him. One of the things that I notice is, in the modern era, there's a very close parallel to Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam. But again, I grew up in the vicinity of IISc, studied there, and knew people from the IITs. People of his vintage in those academic institutions would not talk very highly about his academic capabilities. He was actually rejected from faculty positions when he went and tried. Finally, he went to Anna University, etc. Have there been any kind of mythbusters about Visvesvaraya, or do... So, of course, things like you said about the tracks cracking is clearly a myth. But have there been people who are like, who do not have such a high opinion of Visvesvaraya? Did you encounter any such thing?
Yeah. There are. He has his critics. He had his critics in his day, and he has his critics today. And especially you would know in Karnataka, a lot of books in Kannada coming up in recent years. There's one author, Nanjarajas, who has written a whole book in Kannada. It translates to I Am Kannambadi Dam. Okay, so it's the autobiography of the KRS Dam, and he's basically setting out to establish that Visvesvaraya gets too much credit for it. He's not really the one who built it. There's lots of other people who built it. Now, actually, this is very uncontroversial because it was built over 21 years. Visvesvaraya was the one who got it sanctioned and who fought for it to be sanctioned. But then he became Diwan, and there were many other engineers who were involved in it. So anyone who knows how these things work, yes, there are going to be many people working on this thing. No single person can be responsible for these things. But it's a useful corrective, I think, because a lot of people imagine that this one man went and created this whole dam. So I think that there's work like that. There's one work which is not very popularly known by a practicing civil engineer called N. Shankarappa, who is in Bangalore, and I went and met him. He has, tried to look at all the civil engineering literature of that time and seeing, and look at Visvesvaraya's designs and say, were they actually great? Were they par for the course at that time, and so on. But he didn't get too much attention. I don't think most people have been interested in at all probing the engineering side of Visvesvaraya's life, although it's a paradox. He's seen primarily as an engineer, and most popular accounts go straight to his, his statesman period. And even academics have largely been interested in his economic views and other things. So, so there is some literature, but this book also does try to put into context. So two of the questions I ask are, what was his legacy as an engineer, without talking about his other interventions. And I think the best that I could conclude, I don't have Shankarappa's level of knowledge of engineering, but I did try to look at what other innovations were happening at the time. There's a very famous example of the automatic sluice gates in Khadakwasla, a dam in Khadakwasla, where Visvesvaraya designed this set of gates which automatically moves up and down when there's, when the water level rises. And this is presented as a kind of, as amazing innovation of the time, as if it just sort of sparks fully from his brain. Now, it was a great achievement, but I was able to trace in the archives the fact that several other colleagues before him were trying to do similar things, and there were steps. Even in his time, there were competing designs, and he never claimed that he did it entirely from scratch. His patent was for the improvement of self-acting gates or something like that. So he was fully aware of the context of these things, right? So I think I was able to some extent contextualize that. I also note in the end that he was not the kind of engineer who was contributing to the creation of new theoretical knowledge. If you talk about A.N. Khosla, he has something called the Khosla disk named after him. You've got, it's not like he created new theorems or that he created a new technique or anything like that. He was a great project manager. He could get things done. He was very competent. He was very he was fearless in some senses, but I don't think he would have seen himself either as somebody who is creating new technical knowledge. But that also goes back to the larger question of what is an engineer. I mean, an engineer is many things. An engineer is a bureaucrat. An engineer is a manager. Engineer is is someone who plays many different roles. But yeah.
Aparajith, if I may, at this point, first of all, strange sense of deja vu having been here at the inauguration and the launch of your first book. This was in 2015? 17.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to have you back.
And here again. So someone who has worked in a similar space but with scientists. And I remember the private papers we were just talking about at the Teen Murti, where I saw the private papers of Visvesvaraya, P.C. Mahalanobis, Meghnad Saha, almost together in one sort of set. And your book, which I have not read in its entirety, but just picked up pieces from here and there, which show that there are implicit, if not explicit, conversations between, of course, Mahalanobis, but not Meghnad Saha. Mm-hmm. And I say this because within the larger genealogy of planning that you're looking at, right? So there is that Soviet model of planning on the one hand, and then you are trying to also look into the notions of planning that Visvesvaraya comes from his liberal kind of positions, with a very clearly defined role for the state. Now, what was his relationship with the left kind of planning discourse? Did you find any conversation? Because Meghnad Saha is writing at this time, having the journal Science and Culture, which is taking up all these questions of flood control, irrigation, the Tennessee Valley Corporation, then the Damodar Valley, and all there sort of, there's a large, sort of long conversation. The role of statistics, very much so. It's the same kind of, idea of nation making through the deployments of scientific understanding, knowledge, and so on. So the interwar years are very critical in the shaping of that discourse. So did you find any, how does sort of, Visvesvaraya fit into that conversation? That's number one. And number two is the more, the fascinating part of your book, which I just again picked up. So because it is, as you say, that he's a technocrat, he's not apolitical, but it's a very carefully calibrated politics. And you really dwell on it in several levels. It's the politics is the one, which is calibrating his relationship with the British resident, questions of fiscal autonomy, representation, and so on. And on the other hand, relationship with Gandhi, Nehru, the National Planning Commission, and so on. So this, were you consciously trying to figure out the ways in which he was able to calibrate his political position, which is like walking a tightrope in that context? So one, his conversations within the larger scientific establishment, scientific technocratic establishment vis-a-vis planning, and on the other with the political establishment.
Thank you so much. Really, really interesting questions. One of the, I did find some correspondence with Meghnad Saha, but nothing very substantial. But Saha was a big supporter of Visvesvaraya. He wrote many editorials in Science and Culture supporting Visvesvaraya and anointing him the pioneer of planning, as the pioneer of planning in India. I think planning and development was a broad church, right? I mean, if you think of the National Planning Committee, you have people of all kinds. You have industrialists, you have leftist politicians, you have scientists, and it was meant to be a coalition. It was meant to be a coalition of interests, and so I think they tried to minimize their political differences on many levels. The same with Visvesvaraya and Gandhi. They had an interesting correspondence, which has now morphed into a supposed face-to-face conversation on WhatsApp, which has never happened to my knowledge. But they had an interesting correspondence where they're trying to thrash out their differences. Visvesvaraya is trying to downplay the differences and so on. So I think there is this sense of creating because they have certain common aims. Having said that, and Saha, of course, respects him as a fellow technical, person and so on. But having said that, I think Visvesvaraya is quite clear that he was not for socialism or communism. He didn't have a very sophisticated language to talk about it. In his memoirs, he lists socialism, communism as one of the threats to national security, along with war and invasions and other things. So he's very clear that I think he would fit right into the Bombay Plan group of thinkers, right? So he wants the state to come in, create the conditions for the flourishing of capitalism, and then allow these large capitalists to take over and then create industries and so on. And so that's his broad orientation. The thing about his interaction with Mahalanobis and Saha and others is that he's much, much older. So there's a generation gap. And I couldn't find any correspondence with Mahalanobis, but I did find that Visvesvaraya was one of the vice presidents of the Indian Statistical Institute in the 1930s, which meant that he was a kind of symbolic cheerleader for it. He was a big fan of statistics. For Visvesvaraya, statistics did not mean any kind of complex operations. It meant the collection of data, the amassing of data and comparing data from one country to another. So comparative data analysis. So every speech would have the literacy of UK is so much, the literacy of Mysore is so much, the per capita income of America is so much, per capita income of Mysore is so much. So that's how he'd frame his arguments. But he was a huge proponent of collection of statistics, and he was actually chairman of something called the Indian Economic Enquiry Committee in 1925, which many statisticians or people in the statistical bureaucracy today credit as one of the first bodies to initiate the creation of a statistical machinery in government in India. So clearly there were overlaps. Of course, Mahalanobis became much more powerful in the 1950s. Visvesvaraya kind of is pushed aside, partly because of his differences with Nehru on the level of state intervention, on the level of controls on capitalists and other things, but also partly because he's already 90. But yeah, there's a little bit in the book about these interactions, but it would have. I'm sure at some point there's going to be some more detail about this emerging.
Hi, Aparajith. Firstly, Looking forward to reading your book. Leah recommended already that I read it because I'm looking at infrastructure in the present. So my question is very broad and very presentist because we are a presentist discipline. So I was just thinking that, technical expertise is thought of in two sort of. One is the valorization of technical knowledge and this like nation builders, etc. And then you have the academic, like rule of the expert becomes a pejorative term where it's like these are experts who never understand society, never think of politics and think of a technocratic solution for all sorts of problems. So from that I have two questions. One is in your book do you find, or in your work do you find instances of how society and politics speaks back to Visvesvaraya as he's working, and how does politics and society or social issues come back and influence the kinds of work, engineering works he's undertaking as he's undertaking them? So what is the relation with things on the ground to how he's executing projects? And the second question was this also, the place of the engineer, and this is currently, if I speak to engineers or other people, engineering corps in development is seen as you become an engineer to earn money from the development status cutbacks mostly. I don't want to say this about all engineers, but there is also lowering of valorization of engineering within development in contemporary times a little bit. Maybe so then throughout Visvesvaraya, okay,
MV, we can call him MV.
MV. So throughout his life, does the position of engineering within the nation building process also change? Like, does the valorization change over his long lifetime also? What is the place of the expert in development circles, in sort of political circles, etc.?
That block irrigation part where this whole
Yes. Absolutely. So, thanks for that question. There was a lot of negotiation involved. Nobody accepted his vision just like that. I mean, he was in positions of power, and that's why he was able to make it work. But there were always opponents. And Leah's just reminded me the block irrigation system, which he introduced in the Deccan when he was in his 40s, was meant to be, so there's a way in which, you divide canal water into specific blocks in villages along the length of the canal, and then practice a form of crop rotation within that. It was to encourage people to grow higher value crops like sugarcane and rice. And there was I won't go into it now, but there was a complex debate between, is the role of the canal to prevent famine and help people grow some food crops in the year of drought, or is it meant to encourage the production of high value crops, which can then raise the standard of living and help them to buy food when there's a drought, etc. So he came down very strongly on the commercial side, right? That agriculture has to be commercialized. Perhaps it's no coincidence that area, the Nira Canal and other places where he introduced a block system of irrigation, is now a huge sugar belt in Maharashtra. So but at the time there was of course pushback. There were people who were saying immediately, and not even social and other engineers were pushing back, saying that has he never heard of rack renting? So if you allot blocks even randomly, the people in the block are in an advantageous position, and there is supposed to be a kind of exchange of land so that different people get a chance to be in the block. But people are like, nobody's going to do this. Nobody who is in the block is going to allow anybody else to exchange their land and come in. And then who's overseeing this? A punch formed of the sarpanch and two mamlatdar and some two other government officials. So this is ripe for to be taken over by the local elites, right? So there was a lot of pushback about that. It was eventually sanctioned, the block system, but it underwent so many changes due to many other reasons, including side effects that were not entirely foreseen, like waterlogging and salinity and so on, that it became very different. But there was pushback. Again, in the case of the KRS dam, there was a very fascinating debate between him and the financial secretary of Mysore, at the time a 30-something Bengali officer called J.S. Chakravarti. And the debates they had, these long memos, really fascinating reading. Chakravarti basically says, by saying that you are going to firstly displace people to create this dam, but then import huge amounts of people to settle these agricultural land and then produce sugarcane and rice, you're making huge sociological interventions and assumptions. And there's a lot of back and forth. Eventually, Visvesvaraya says, I'm simplifying, but he tells the Maharaja he's going to quit, and the Maharaja says, no, you make your dam. but that's, I'm being facetious. But yes, he always had these pushback. But what is notable, I think, is that most of the kinds of, and then he had severe critics in the 1920s, one of whom launched a series of diatribes against him in various newspapers, and Visvesvaraya kept a log of all these things that were said about him, and it's fascinating. But what's interesting is that all of these criticisms at the time were either sometimes on sociological grounds, mostly on financial grounds, saying that this is a huge, this is a grandiose use of public money. And by the way, he was one of the first to talk about deficit financing. So the fact that the state can go into debt to create a productive enterprise. And that was not kindly taken to by many people, right? So those were the grounds on which he criticized, not so much some of the environmental grounds which we would today criticize some of his works on. But I fully agree with your point. I think it's so easy for us to say, all technical solutions, they're simplistic and they don't understand. We rely on them all the time. We live in a built world. We live in an engineered world. And I think, in fact, the biography is a form that allows me to take a nuanced view on those kinds of matters.
Thank you so much for your book, sir. I had just two small questions. The first question, which has partly been answered right now, but did Visvesvaraya sir change his views? What we are hearing is pushbacks and his replies, but did his views about certain things evolve over time, in response to these pushbacks? That was my first question. My second question was related to the methods that you went through, were the archives that you went through, were they multilingual in nature? And if yes, what were the challenges in, say, translation of these archives?
Thank you, Satya. Very good questions. I'll have to think deeply about instances where he changed his views. I'm sure there were. But on the whole, for a person who's in public life for 70 years, he changes his views very little. He's very consistent, which could speak for his courage of conviction. But you could look at it both ways. But having said that, sorry, your second question was about the archives. Visvesvaraya was a Telugu speaker at home. He grew up in a Kannada-speaking environment, of course. But almost all of his writing that I have been able to trace was in English. His collection of books was almost all in English. His scrapbook, his papers, the news. So he thought in English. He lived in English. He worked in a bureaucracy that worked in English. There are cuttings from Kannada newspapers in his papers. And of course, there's a huge secondary literature of people talking about him, many kinds of biographies and so on. So what I did do is I tried to learn the script a little bit. I speak Tamil and Telugu, so I can understand a little bit of Kannada through, it's related. And we spent time, my family and I spent time we spent a whole summer in Mysore, Bangalore. We went back several times. So I did try to get a familiarity with what was being said. I got hold of all the Kannada material, got somebody to read out the chapter titles to me, read out excerpts. I got some pages translated, so that I got a sense of is this saying something? Are these sources saying something that that I have not seen elsewhere? As it turned out, most of the Kannada material is secondary and there is some redundancy with the other literature which is available in English. So it was fortunate for me, but I strongly, just for the kicks, I would like to do a project which involves many languages. But more seriously, I think it is very important to. We all know the shortcomings of relying on only one language and one type of source. It just so happens that in this case, that was, I think, adequate to cover his life.
We have time for one more question and then last question.
Hi, Professor. When you are writing a book for such a long time, for like 7-8 years, like how do you keep yourself going? I'm sure there must be blocks somewhere and you would have lost motivation. So yeah, what's the thing that keeps you going for such a long time? And my second question is, what's the probability that your next book is a novel?
I think what kept me going was support. I had lots of support. People who put up with me being, in my own mind, being absent, getting up in the middle of the night, going away to write for 2 hours, coming back, and so on. All of you guys putting up with me being absent-minded in class on some days. And by the way, Chinmay is one of many students who assisted with me with. He helped me get some pictures and so on, and others at various points helped. So I'm thankful to all of you for that. And I think, but how do you keep yourself going? I think it's actually. It's useful to have some kind of a goal. The difficult part was after it was done. I went into depression for a while because I didn't know what to do. But I think now I'm enjoying myself, and I don't think I can write a novel. I don't think I have the talent or the guts to write about various things. As they, you need to be brave to write a good novel, and you can write a superficial novel. But yeah, maybe just relax for a while.
Thank you everyone for coming. I think Aparajith has some chocolates for everyone.
They're probably at the back. I'm sorry we couldn't do coffee and tea, but we do have some world famous in Ahmedabad, Jai Hind mixed bites at the back. So you can get some of them.